as part of this discussion. The second one in the series of FOG's Open Consultation Mondays. Not every Monday, but we try to have a couple of Mondays per month, 2 Mondays if we can per month. And the topic this time is shifting geopolitics and its impact on global governance and the UN. So I think we can go to the mode that we see each other and not the opening slide. And we are recording. I hope you don't mind, and live streaming. Just to tell you again the rationale that you've seen already when you registered for this topic is that we see all the changes that are happening around us, the wars that are continuing, the impacts of climate change, the political upheavals including in the US or changes and all that augur a different period. And we're wondering what the role of global governance, the UN, all these institutions that we have now. We saw recently the BRICS meeting mentioning the UN and global governance, the Group of 7, the Group of 20, the G20 meeting in Brazil, and the UN a bit absent at the high political stage, perhaps. But you tell us also what you think and how could we interpret what's happening and how can we also work towards to take the positive things out of what is happening as lessons for the future and as a new era that will hopefully be up to the task of dealing with humanity's global issues such as climate, pandemics, wars, inequality, the financial system, and what have you. So your projections, your thoughts from your experience are always very welcome. You can raise your electronic hand. I don't know if anybody wants to start already. And it's good to see old friends here that I've not seen for a while in meetings of folks. Thank you. So who would take a first cut? How do you see the world now and geopolitics shaping the world and global governance? And what should be done? I can volunteer somebody, but I don't see. There is Jose Luis Guerrero. I had warned him that I would give him the floor.
Sure, I can start.
Old colleague, UN ambassador of the OSCE, of the Council of Europe.
Well,
lots of experience.
Precisely, or maybe, I don't know. I think I'm as puzzled as probably most of you or everyone is in not really knowing where we go from here. We had many surprises. I think most of us are quite aged already, and we have seen how things developed in ways that we did not expect recently and not so recently. So I'm quite shy at making predictions. The general I think state of mind is relatively somber. But as we had surprises in the past, when the future looked brighter, maybe we have surprises now, where the future doesn't look that bright in the other direction. I think as in the call for the meeting, you stated in the call for the meeting, what's happening with the BRICS is one of the key aspects. And then the reaction of the US to what happens with the BRICS. That's the other thing. So whether the BRICS are going to go further on the economic realm only is already done question, and whether they would venture also into some kind of political or security fields as well. If they stay the course that they initiated, which is more or less about development, about alternative to the dollar, to the dominance of the dollar, about the possibility to finance development through their own development bank and other means, about the possibility of developing trade between themselves. I think all this is positive. I'll be blunt. To me, this is positive. And I don't see how people who have been working in the development area, in all the development agencies of the developed world, when we see countries actually developing, how can we be upset about it? There is a contradiction there. And I can be even clearer. I think all of us think that every Chinese and every Indian has the right to have a relatively good education, good health, fridge at home, running water, hot water, and so on and so forth. This, in concrete terms, means being in favor of the Chinese economy surpassing the American economy, not only slightly, but doubling it or more one day. The day every Chinese has a standard of living approximately half of an European, which is a good goal, which is a goal that I think, is a bona fide goal. The question that emerges is, what would they do with that wealth? Also India, no? Whether they would use it in a more geopolitical way, confrontationally or not. And I think that is the challenge of our time, that whenever the Chinese economy surpasses the American, which is a good thing, or the Indian, as they are 5 times more people, it's normal that the economy is bigger, how are they going to handle this wealth? This is the challenge, so that they do not react as they have been more or less shown by example, that whenever you have economic might, you have to translate it immediately into geopolitical and military dominance as well. So this is the challenge of our time, how these two emerging big powers are going to handle their own wealth. Mm-hmm. And okay, so that is one question. If they are successful in the economic part in the coming 5 to 10 years to 15 years, so the reaction of the US is what is to be seen, whether they will accept that this is the new status of the world, accommodate to it. This doesn't mean people speak about the decline of the US or the decline of Europe. I don't think there is a decline. The American economy continues to be highly productive, innovative, creative, and so on. It's a relative decline. There's no American economic decline. There is relative to others. So how they handle this is the question. Just accepting that the Chinese are entitled to a standard of living, well, basically like any other developed country, and that means the economy being double the size of the EU or the American economies. Of course, as I said, it depends how the Chinese handle their new wealth and so on. Okay, so one word, since we all like multilateralism and the UN, to me it is a mistake, and it was a mistake of the Summit of the Future, to put everything together. I think the question of the security, the global security architecture, is so complicated and so relevant, and is bringing us to such level of danger, that it deserves to be handled on its own, leaving the rest very nice other objectives for the world, eradication of poverty, even climate change to a certain extent, though climate change is slightly different, but certainly the other issues which are important, gender advancement, development, and so on, even human rights, for a different package of negotiations. Only dealing with the security architecture is complicated enough. And when you see the document of the Summit of the Future, I mean, you cannot just fix everything in one go. Okay, I could go on, but I think it's enough with this, no?
It's a very good start, Jose Luis. Thank you. You try to change our perspective, yes, to think differently. And you're right, I think the Pact for the Future has as its weakest part, perhaps, peace and security. Developing countries wanted to elevate more the development part, of course, and finance. But somebody who was there and was very close to the negotiations and informed the rest of us, also Hen Kiang Brinkman, wants to take the floor, which comes very nicely. Hen Kiang.
Thanks so much, Georges, for this meeting, and Jose Luis for your opening remarks. My remarks would be partly in line with Jose Luis said. I think this period that we are in now really started in 1989 with the end of the Cold War, where we really entered a period of vulnerability, volatility, fragility, especially after the first period in the early 1990s, when there was a period of euphoria in the UN, a unipolar world dominated by the United States, but that really, with Rwanda and Srebrenica and all the financial crises that we had starting in Mexico in 1994. That really showed the vulnerability and fragility and the number of crises that we have had since then. Conflict has been much more difficult to solve because of the enormous increase of the number of non-state armed actors and the externalization and internationalization of conflicts. The Cold War is over, where the UN could put two parties in a room, a rebel movement and a government, negotiate a peace agreement, put peacekeepers in between, implement and support the peace agreement, and that worked very well in Central America, Southern Africa, etc. But we have moved to a multipolar world and are still moving, and that brings with it uncertainty. Certainly with regard to the balance of power, as Jose Luis also said, but I think it's a good thing. The one of the few positive signs that I want to mention on top of Jose Luis. First, a lot of the emerging powers do see the United Nations system and the United Nations as really the bedrock of multilateralism, as an absolutely unique and essential organization, and as a platform to exercise their increased power. And I totally agree also with Jose Luis. It's not a matter of absolute decline of the United States and Europe, but a relative decline. I started at the UN in 1989. Before the Berlin Wall came down, I lived through the euphoria in the early 90s at the UN. But it was also the period of real power by the United States and other developed countries, including Europe. And that's not the case anymore. And that's a good thing. It has become a much more open, inclusive organization. Yes, we are going through some turbulence. That's absolutely right. But that's inherent at this move. The other positive things I want to mention is indeed, the Pact for the Future. And what was absolutely clear in the negotiations, that the number of countries within the UN that feels that the international legal order is absolutely essential for them. I mean, Singapore have been convening these countries. I think it's now more than 60 countries that are members of it. So that's more than a quarter of the UN.
A group of small states, that one? Small states,
yeah, small states. And, Singapore, every time they took the floor, what they said was, the rule of law at the international level is existential for us. It's the only thing that protects us, with, of course, Ukraine in mind. So these are really, I think, positive developments. And of course, these were very strongly reinforced and reaffirmed in the Pact for the Future. I also think that, what Jose Luis said about China is the case in a much broader sense. Yes, the SDGs are not doing that well, but don't forget the progress that we are making and have made. Even at the moment on HIV/AIDS, on child mortality, the number of children dying every year under the age of 5 was 12 million a year just a few decades ago. It's less than 5 million right now. I mean, that is just an incredible progress. And it is partly because of the UN. It is partly because of the vaccination drives and oral rehydration therapy that the UN has been distributing, although the invention was done in Bangladesh, but it was really a therapy that the UN advocated for. Famines basically have disappeared. I mean, the famines that we have seen in throughout history, where millions of people died, do not exist anymore. Yes, famines exist on a smaller scale, including at the moment in Sudan and in Gaza and you name it. But it has been an incredible amount of progress. I leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and you can take the floor again, of course. I don't know if the UN is the same UN as we are used to it, and perhaps that's one of our reactions, that with this multipolar world, the UN is also changing. It's not the UN that we are accustomed to, and many of us here are former UN people. One of them is Yoriko Yasukawa, the Vice President of FOGS, but I don't know what she wants to say, of course. Yoriko. Yeah.
Hi, good morning. I just have sort of 2 or 3 concerns that aren't necessarily, that I haven't really been able to articulate in a coherent whole, but well, one of them has to do with what Hank was saying, that I think it's really important for the UN, whose, I think, its principal power is, you know, the moral authority, I think, that comes from representing and encompassing all the countries in the world, despite all of the disagreements that there might be. And based on that moral authority to convey a moral narrative about the world. And I think that we've kind of, you know, not been doing as much as we could in terms of conveying a narrative that directs or nudges the world in a positive direction of more solidarity. And I think one of them is what Hank was saying about the positive accomplishments that have been supported by the UN that don't necessarily have to do directly with the security sphere, but in terms of making life better for millions of people around the world. And I think, you know, there's a lot more that we can do in terms of bringing that to the fore as a meaningful role for the UN. That's one thing. And then a couple of concerns that I see, having lived for many years now in the Latin America region and being about to move back to my part of the world, to Japan. In the Latin America region, I see with, especially with the recent victory of Trump, just this reinforcement of permission of authoritarian-leaning political leaders to do their thing, you know. And even before that, there's, you know, I live in Costa Rica, which is a pioneer, a world pioneer in terms of maintaining a really vibrant and solid democracy, respect for human rights, protection of the environment. But we now have a Trump wannabe president who really actively emulates that style of demeaning and attacking political opponents, of denigrating the justice system for getting in his way. And now he's forming an alliance with the authoritarian leader in El Salvador, Bukele. And by the way, Matt Gaetz, who's just been nominated as Attorney General, is a big fan of Bukele's. And this approach of, you know, massive incarceration of even suspected criminals. And so that's very concerning because I see that Trump and other authoritarians are also giving authoritarian-leaning political leaders permission to behave badly in this part of the world. And also, I see, you know, I've spent much of my UN career in this part of the world where I think things started out being more, so to speak, permeable to UN advocacy on issues of human rights, of democracy, and so on. But I see that space closing, even in these past, you know, 10 years or so. Partly because I think the countries feel empowered, both technically, economically, to define their own paths, which is, I think, as it should be. But on the other hand, I see that the UN isn't really up to what it needs to do to be able to add value to what the countries themselves are trying to do. Well, you know, in terms of technical knowledge, capacity, it just isn't, we don't offer much. So I think this is something that needs to be thought about. And then in my part of the world, in East Asia, and particularly in Japan, I do worry that this change in administration in the US is going to disempower people in my country who are trying to protect the so-called peace constitution, and empower those of the extreme right that, you know, we're barely been able to keep under control, exacerbate the political conflict between Japan, China, Korea, and I think that's a challenge that the UN should be paying more attention to. I'm not sure what can be done about it, but yeah, just as a red light that I wanted to throw out. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuriko. Jose Luis spoke earlier of the possibility of a positive surprise out of what is happening, but you saw the immediate dangers, I think more dangers that we are facing now, and they're quite real. Hopefully, the surprises will come and the narrative that you talked about will also take shape more. Carlos has Batallas has experience with a humanitarian experience around the world, right, Carlos? Tell us a bit about yourself. Also
hello, everyone. My name is Carlos Batallas. I've spent 30 years with the International Committee of the Red Cross, always in the field, apart from 2 stints in Geneva. So we are a wide experience all around. I think that I just wanted to bring one thought to this fantastic table, and it's about the disrespect of the international law. And looking out from international humanitarian law, what we are witnessing in many different countries, in Sudan, in Gaza, etc., is not that the international law, the international humanitarian law is not working. But the problem is that it's not respected, and it's less and less respected. And this is the link with Yuriko, with Hank, with Jose Luis, with what's going on with Trump and with these authoritarian people that are deciding that the law is what they mean it to be. And they are carving out all the elements that the morality, the ethical of the international law, IHL in particular, and how this is going to erode the important role of international humanitarian law in a world that is going to more and more conflict. So that's something that for me, it's because it's my profession, of course, but it's really worrying me a lot. What's going to happen the day that every single combatant in the world is saying, anyway, I'm the only idiot respecting IHL? Okay, let's forget it and let's go for total war. Let's finish with all the efforts that we are carrying out since 1863 with the First Geneva Convention in 1864. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Scary indeed. Yes. How was the time different when they really came up with these conventions, and now we cannot respect them or improve them? Yeah. Why? Yeah. Thank you. And Stephen Brown, also long experience with the UN.
A lot of
Yes.
pessimism in this virtual room, and I'm afraid I'm not going to dispel very much of it. I mean, I think it's useful to take a historic view, as some speakers have, going from the rather frozen state of the Cold War, the duopoly, until '89, followed by the unipolar world until about the early 2010s, I suppose. And now we have a situation of what I would call geopolitical opportunism, where you've got multiple poles, although the single pole of international finance still lies with the US, of course. But I'm asking myself in those circumstances, whether there ever was any global governance, except when you had the kind of American administration in the 90s and early 2000s, which seemed to be broadly in line with supporting the principles and values of the Charter. Now we don't have that anymore. So it's fine, I think, to have numbers of member states in the UN, such as the small states led by Singapore, or the laughingly called Friends of the UN Charter led by none other than Venezuela. But who is actually going to do the enforcing of the Charter? Everybody signs up to it. I mean, even Putin's lackeys seem to say that they are attempting to be in line with UN international and humanitarian law, when of course they're not. But the answer, and this is where I dare to be slightly more sort of solution oriented, the answer is a strong Secretary General, which we've never had since Dag Hammarskjöld. Now I know, Georgios and others have heard me rabbit on about this, but if you haven't got somebody to enforce the principles which nominally 193 countries say they have signed up to and will abide by, then the UN really has no role to play. Now, of course, everybody's immediately going to say, where are we going to find such a person? Where are we going to find a new Dag Hammarskjöld? Where are we going to find somebody who is capable of mustering and marshalling support among the member states? But it has to be done. I don't see any alternative for the UN. And I think what the last few Secretary Generals have signally failed to do is to convene the interested parties, to convene the vocal proponents in favor of the UN Charter and force certain things to happen. Make sure that famous article, I think it's 37.2, is enforced to make sure that Russia cannot veto a decision about the Ukraine war which it's perpetrating. Make sure that every letter of the UN Charter can be interpreted in a broad and aggressive manner with support of a good caucus of like-minded countries. Otherwise, the UN Charter, which hypocritically so many countries still say they have signed up to, will continue to be meaningless. So I'm sorry, that's not a very realistic proposition, but let me just say, in parenthesis, I'm all for the 1 in 8 billion campaign in favor of, it seems to be focusing on getting a female Secretary General. Fine. It really doesn't, to me, gender is important, but it's not as important as getting a Secretary General who's going to stand up to the big powers. If we're not going to have a future Secretary General like that, then really the UN will continue to disappear into oblivion.
Thank you, Stephen. I think many of us who work for the UN share this, that we would like to see a stronger UN, but the Secretary General may have seen what happened to Dag Hammarskjöld, how he died, and I think all big powers want to get rid of him, and his plane suddenly crashed. But anyway, he's our martyr. Let's see what Gary Slatkin from WHO, among other things.
Sorry, Dag Hammarskjöld was working alone. That was the problem. What he didn't succeed in doing was getting the growing number of developing countries on his side who are members of the UN. You can't work alone. No Secretary General can work alone. That's the point, I think.
Thanks, indeed. Gary.
Yeah, this is quite a strong group you've pulled together, Yorgos. And so I'm also really favorable to what Yannicka was saying and Stephen, that so with the backdrop of what others have said, which is, so this is a tumultuous time, but the UN Charter has to be the grounding. And I don't know how widely known the UN Charter is and its basic principles. And so there's a lot of the as it were, enforcement of anything is what the norms are and what the social pressure is to maintain any law or principle. So the ideal situation for me, given the way I'm seeing all of this rise of authoritarianism that we're all seeing, and a bunch of mischievous and in fact, people with real malice, in fact, developing these obedient, unfree orders within their own country, and a lot of, audacity or just feeling they can do whatever they want. I mean, this is really an illness that, a psychological illness that is, in a way, contagious across the globe at the moment. But I don't think it's impervious to pressures from inside and outside, but the pressures really need to be intensified and continuous. So what I would imagine is really what Stephen was saying, but in both parts. One is there has to be a Secretary General that is, without a doubt, coming from moral authority and can be convincing, persuasive, and heard continuously, globally. A voice and a set of voices around this person that are continuously condemning various things in the most polite and diplomatic way possible, as well as encouraging the correct behaviors. And in having a group, I mean, there have to be diplomatic efforts all the time. I mean, for example, within the country of the US, the new country, the new US, there are probably a couple dozen people who are going to have Mr. Trump's ear. And they're worse than him, the people who are around him. And so, but I think people coming from sideways, from outside the country and that are heard globally will have influence. I mean, just to stay on this particular person for the moment, somehow or other, he has an imagination that he could win a Nobel Prize in his ultra grandiosity, which again is way beyond illness. But it is something that could, alter behavior. Similarly for other people. So I see this, it has similarities to what I wrote, that may or may not still be on the FOG's page, of having continuous diplomatic efforts to the 6 or 20 places and the 6 or 20 people, and that where we're just always in their ear, we being the UN. The UN is always buzzing in their ear about what isn't going right and how you yourself can be a real leader towards a better world, and so on. This has worked with tribes and cartels and so on. There's ways to be persuasive, to put something in people's ears continuously. And I don't think moral authority it can be poo-pooed, but it can't be ignored forever. And especially because the populations of the world want order, and they want their own freedom, and they want justice, and they see injustice. And they're being told to shut up about it. So I think that this is really I don't know what steps this group or others can make towards trying to influence possible selections, and then to go from there into how to be helpful to that person and his or her associates. But they need this has to be a continuous high level communication and outreach effort. That's what I would see.
Thank you, Gary. So you are for engagement, even if we disagree with it. It's good to stay engaged and try to influence. And of course, Gary has also, as a medical doctor himself, he has proposed approaches to violence as a pandemic. And you can read a very interesting paper there that finds many similarities in addressing also these issues that can be seen as pandemics. And yeah, thanks a lot. John Vlasto, he is the chair of the World Federalist Movement. Is that the correct title, John?
That's exactly right, Georgios. Yes, I was going to mention that because I don't know most of the people on this call, so I was going to briefly mention that. That's who I am, chair of the World Federalist Movement. Gary was saying what a strong group this is. I found it a privilege listening to people here, and I was particularly taken with the somewhat optimistic opening remarks, which was nice to hear. Gary said, what a strong group. I'm probably one of the weakest members of the group. I have not been in this world for very long. So I have a question really, rather than a comment for the group. I'm currently in Baku at the climate COP. My understanding of the science, and I'm no scientist, is that the scientists are really very alarmed at not just climate, but the environmental situation in general. I was speaking to somebody here actually who's private sector, been working on measuring carbon for a number of years, and he's become alarmed about AI and thinks that AI may be causing us huge risk even before the environment does. Either which way, it doesn't feel like there's a lot of time, in my understanding, to continue with the status quo. The world is changing around us, and humanity is facing very serious risks. And things are going to change. So the question I'd like to put out there, maybe the optimists might be good people to answer it. They might have see a path of hope here. Is given the geopolitical situation, this is talking to the topic of the evening. What can those of us in civil society do? What can we leverage? Where are our points of leverage to start creating the governance we need? I mean, 29 COPs and carbon emissions are continuing to go up. We are absolutely on a path to catastrophe. Traditionally it takes a world war to reform global governance, but that is not a very healthy theory of change today. So what would we be well advised to do in civil society to try and bring about the change in global governance we need? Thank you. And thank you, Georgios, for organizing this.
Thank you, John, and you also convened the Mega Alliance for the Environment. Now I cannot remember the exact name, what it stands for, but of course, you're very active in all these global issues, and you talked as civil society, while some of us still think like UN, meaning that we think that through the UN that we served during our career, that we can still have an influence through that. And it's good, and the question will be answered, I hope, in the process. And good luck in Baku. Yes, John.
If I can just respond to you on MEGA. So MEGA, for people's information, stands for Mobilizing an Earth Governance Alliance. If you're not American, depending on your sense of humor, and this might annoy some people, it can also stand for Make Earth Great Again. And for me, taking MAGA on directly is absolutely fine, because really it's the Earth we need to worry about, not America. And that is a coalition of civil society, like-minded states and others to try and implement the reform recommendations for climate governance put together by Maya Groff's Climate Governance Commission report. And I should add, I worked with Georgios and the team redrafting the second charter. So when the General Assembly is ready, we have a draft for them to start the discussion from.
Great, yes, involved in many great projects, which the time of which will come, we hope. Tom Vis, the historian of global governance, I think, in the UN. I'm glad you reemerged. We missed you. Tom.
Thanks, Georgios. I've been struggling here because the opening comment was talking about positive surprises, but we haven't heard any during the course of the conversation, or at least not as I've been listening. Somehow geopolitics, and it's not just because I'm sitting in Chicago, but when I was graduating from college, the Shah of Iran was giving the commencement address. And at that point, I said, things can't possibly be worse than the Shah. Well, lo and behold, that was totally wrong, and we found that out. And it seems to me that, in fact, while this seems to be one of the lowest multilateral points in my career, things are going to get worse. I mean, I think much worse. Whether it's climate, you know, day one, the US will be out of Paris, and that then provides India and China with all the wherewithal they need to stop pretending they're doing enough about the climate. It seems to me that in terms of financing, it's going to be everything from UNRWA to peacekeeping and far beyond. And the kind of previous pulling out of whether it's ILO in the old days or UNESCO or UN Women or whatever it is going to be front and center. And if we're interested in Security Council, whatever action, let alone reform, I think there's just going to be paralysis. So I'm still struggling with the efforts of alternative charters. It's almost as if I go to the gym and you talk to your trainer and you can't lift 50 pounds. So he says, why don't you lift 500? This moment for me is one to sort of anticipate the worst and try to sustain the crumbling foundations, not to imagine visions of the future. I think we're going to have to deal with the chaos and the mess of the present. So I hope somebody else can disabuse me of my pessimism, but there it is.
Thank you. Very realistic, but with I think the rest of us may think that this is the lowest point, that we're getting there and can only go up, but we have been thinking like that for a while, maybe. It's getting lower and lower, yeah? Yeah, so Jose Luis, coming back, the optimist strikes back, yes.
Okay, yes. On John's, I thought about the Munga, no? The Make the UN Great Again movement. It's the Munga. Thomas, I'm as pessimistic as all of you are, obviously. Yet, for me, the BRICS development or BRICS-related developments are not necessarily negative, not at all. For years, even for decades, many people were calling from, we need a stronger South-South cooperation. We need a stronger South-South interaction. We need a Southern upheaval to balance the predominance of the Western North. So the BRICS has a lot of that. And now it has come at a moment where, or it has taken the stage for reasons that we do not necessarily like. And the movement being led, perhaps not by the optimal leader. But in itself, to me, is not bad at all. When I see meetings, when you don't see a single Western face taking important global decisions, let's remember that the West is about 15% of the population, going down to 10, eventually 8. So obviously there will be more and more meetings where no Westerners present. And those meetings have to be relevant because these people are relevant. They are more relevant, in fact. So I don't see the BRICS developments necessarily as a negative thing at all. We have to see how it goes. And as I said, the economic part of it has very interesting aspects. Whether it veers politically, that I don't know, and that's obviously a more sensitive question. Henk, I would like to share your optimism, but I can't. I maybe it's just because I'm not informed enough. But to me, the UN is falling into irrelevance. As clear as that. I share with you, and I've heard it many times from important speakers, that for medium powers and small powers is the only place they have. And therefore, they have a great attachment to it. It's the only place where they can go and speak to a broad audience. But for emerging powers is less and less relevant. Now, tell me the amount of decisions either not taken by the UN that the UN should have taken if application of the Charter was to be stricter, or taken and disregarded. I mean, they grow exponentially. Nobody cares anymore. For the bigger geopolitical things, as I said before, I think the UN, in my view, maybe you don't share this, but for me it was a mistake to put everything on the same plate. Honestly, I think the security aspect of the Charter was the basis of the Charter, remains the basis of the Charter, and should be dealt separately from many other issues that certainly are good issues and deserve attention and effort, but they blur the picture. And you see that document of the Summit of the Future. I mean, you cannot really digest so many things in one single document. Just a few things on the ICC. Carlos spoke about it. The last episodes of the International Criminal Court and International Court of Justice, to me, I think have weakened them because they have showed there's no impact. I might be wrong. It may be that in 3 years' time, or maybe in one, we see some things happening that prove that these two institutions have some impact in the real world. But if I were a citizen of the places that are affected by the issues dealt by the court, I would feel totally let down by this court. This is useless to me. I am the victim. Whatever they're doing, experts think is great. Legal experts think they are very courageous. Me, I'm the victim, is useless to me. So I think pretty much, and that applies for the International Criminal Court. We know the indictments or the investigations, the open investigations. And then for the International Criminal Court, the Court of Justice, the last two on the Ukraine. So to me, it's losing ground. Some days it even looks like this is a League of Nations. I mean, something that, okay, but it has employed thousands of people like us, and we keep on making noise and around, but speak to the real people of the world, to the 8 billion. I don't think they say that. Now, to our distinguished Japanese colleague, also, I think there is a lot of optimism. That moral, common moral for the world, or common narrative, I know, Georgios, you like this very much. I'm not sure that is a good idea, number one. And I don't think it's going through a very good time either, because precisely what people are saying is no, different parts of the world, different cultures, different stories, we see the world differently. And now you listen to our way of seeing the world, with the coming back, and in some aspects rightly so, there are plenty of things still from the era of colonialism that you, the West, don't speak about. We want to speak about them, because for you, that's the past. For us, it's not so much the past. It's a past, but it's a recent past. We want to talk about colonialism still nowadays. So, and all these things bring different perceptions. You have imposed on us a view of the world. Me, I'm a total human rights defender, as you can imagine. I do believe in the universality of a number of these things, but not of all. And speaking tactically, more than I think I heard around in my last traveling around that all these idea of emphasizing inclusiveness, all these idea of fuzzing the basics of human rights is bringing a negative, and we can see it even in the West, a very negative backlash. And people, and it's generating, is not doing good to democratization, is not doing good for insisting on ideas which may be very good, but might be a little bit too advanced yet for some peoples around the world or some cultures. I don't know. But the fact is that he's losing ground. I mean, I remember when I was going around the world with human rights and democracy in my mouth all the time, and everybody agreed. And now I keep on saying the same thing, and now not everybody agrees anymore. Not every, and people of goodwill and good reason. So it's not so clear on how to go about the future. For me, I see a lot of danger in polarization, even in our polarization. In that we start compartmentalizing, we start defining bad guys around, and we lose the capacity to talk with them or to them. I think this is bad. It may make people feel good about themselves, but it's bad strategically. I don't think it's going to bring anything good except more polarization around the world and more division. So precisely to those who think differently, you still have to speak to them or reach out to them and not drift apart further. No, thank you.
So you're inclusive after all, and our narrative is in the making.
I am, but I see the reaction in the world.
If it is a Western-only inclusiveness or a Western way of seeing the world, of course. Thanks, Henk-Jan.
Thanks so much. Of course, we can all recognize the negative trends, and I'm not denying those. Indexes on the rule of law and democracy have been declining over the last 10 years or so. There's no doubt about it. But surveys also show that actually there is still enormous support among the general public for the values of human rights and democracy. It is just that they haven't delivered any real changes. And that's why, for example, in South Africa, 72% of the population prefers an autocrat if he or she delivers a decline in crime and more jobs. That is what people really care about. And that is really the problem that we're facing, I think, in many ways. Yes, the UN has become maybe less relevant in peace and security, but still about 90% of the world resources that go through multilateral channels with regard to peace and security go through the UN. About 50% of humanitarian assistance goes through the UN, and only about 10% of the development assistance. But still, UN has an incredible important role in norm setting on the development side. And in policy setting, and the SDGs is a real example of that norm setting, and I think that has been a real change and a real improvement with 20 years ago, for example, because these discussions on norm setting, starting with the MDGs and the global goals that were set in the conferences in the 1990s at the UN. Starting with the summit of children, with the Convention of the Rights of the Child, and also the discussions on the international financial architecture reform. It is amazing. It's really amazing that these discussions are taking place at the UN and not in Washington, and they should be at the UN. There's now an agreement that the International Tax Cooperation should take place at the UN. There will be a negotiated convention on international tax cooperation, an amazing achievement. All these discussions took place at the OECD, with only a limited amount of member states at the table. The UN has 193 member states, and they should all be part of these negotiations. So it really, you have to look at, if the UN is in decline, what part of the UN are you talking about? As I said in my earlier remarks, in the peace and security area, yes, the UN has become less relevant, and the Security Council is part to blame, the SG is partly to blame, but it's also so much more difficult, the security environment that we're living in. It is not that easy as it was during the Cold War. And I think they're really important to recognize that. Still, at the Summit of the Future, the UN is the platform where everybody feels they need to be there. And that has changed also tremendously. The numbers that are coming to New York to these annual meetings have been increasing to the tens of thousands, including, NGOs, civil society, private sector, the media. So there is still an incredible attraction to the UN, and actually the trust in the UN is still fairly high, despite enormously declines in trust in governments in general. And I also would mention two more things: the colonialism. I do think that is a really important issue, and I think you can also see there improvements. These discussions are taking place for the first time at the UN. And I think in terms of there are also developed countries and former colonial powers acknowledging that they made mistakes. Apologies are officially being expressed at the UN about all the troubles. There's language in the Declaration of Future Generations, which is part of the Pact for the Future, on the atrocities being committed in the past. Of course, they're very hesitant around reparations. I acknowledge that, but the beginning is these discussions are taking place, and I think that's really important. The second last thing I wanted to mention is there are so many common grounds that are still not explored enough, I would say, among the member states. Yes, and I also wanted to react to some of the comments in the chat. Don't forget that both the Gaza and the Ukraine resolutions in the General Assembly got more than 140 member states voting in favor. And there are only 6, 7, or 8, or sometimes 10, but that's about the maximum countries voting against. And that's, it's Russia, but with Syria and Belarus and some very old associated powers. But for example, Cuba and China are not always voting in the same line as Russia is. What is really important, and I think on the economic side, is that we keep one system of norms. And there is a real danger of fragmentation. And the Secretary General has been warning against that many, many times. And so the BRICS is a really good development. I totally agree with that. But we don't want to have a system, where the BRICS sets up its own trade policies and it set up its own financial systems and setting up its own, payment system, for example. And a lot of that is still dominated by the West, and that needs to change. It needs to really change where emerging powers have a seat at the table. And there are many areas where this is happening. I mean, I was very much involved in internet governance, for example, with the World Summit and Information Society in the early 2000s. It was dominated by the US. ICANN was a company licensed by the US Department of Commerce. That is not the case anymore. And that is partly because of these discussions at the UN. And there is a much more global set of governance around the internet. And that will continue. AI was also an issue where there is, for the first time, an agreement in the Pact for the Future that there will be some governance of AI. Of course, it's going to be very difficult to do that. But there are dialogues taking place. It's also a commitment, and that those will all happen at the UN. So positive developments, despite a lot of geopolitical tension and some negative trends. There's no doubt about it. But we have to keep working on incremental change and enforcement of the Charter. The Charter is a beautiful document. No Article 109 review, please, of the Charter, because we will never get a better document than we have in the Charter. Yes, if we can agree on Security Council reform, and I think there's also some optimistic signs around that, agreed in the Pact for the Future. Yes, we should review this if there is an agreement in 10, 15 years, but no review of the Charter because it's an excellent document. We just need to enforce it. And there are many ways that we can increase enforcement of the Charter, including, for example, GA resolutions overriding vetoes. Thanks so much.
Indeed, Yang. Of course, it's a negotiation, what's happening also at the same time. And as you said, incremental change or faster change, those who have the power now, they will never give it up, right? So, I mean, the dollarization, de-dollarization, there is the pace also of change, and who the UN will have now as the new supporter, if the US was before the creator and main guide. Yes, it's all this, and what will happen with the next meetings. Oops, somebody has here there. Sorry. So all these questions for the last half hour, I would like also us to think the Secretary General, the UN, whom they can rely on now. Is it the BRICS? It is smaller states? Is it medium-sized states? In what way? And how can we use upcoming events like Financing for Development, the fourth Finance for Development Conference, or the Social Summit that I think will also take place next year. Other things, other occasions, the 80th anniversary of the UN coming up next year, other things like that. And sorry, Jan, for delaying giving you the floor. Thanks again for being with us. Another Costa Rican participation, right? From Costa Rica too. I think you were. Yeah,
yes,
you told us.
Yes, well, thank you. I'm so glad to be here, and so many good, strong reflections. And I think it's so important that we put our heads together on all of this. I just have three things to say. People want security and jobs. People also want peace and respect for their human rights. So we need to put all of these things in the mix. I know it gets complicated and it's complex, but that's where we need to push ourselves as human beings. I have done some work with the Inter-American Court of Human Rights here in Costa Rica. Actually, it's in my neighborhood. We did a strategic exercise with them in 2016, projecting the future of the court into the year 2035. And one of the things that I have learned about this worldwide court system that exists is that I think we're not pushing enough on the mechanism that could be strengthened. The funding is not so good. The people are very dedicated, et cetera, et cetera. The one in Africa is, emerging. There was an interesting meeting here in Costa Rica last year where the president of three of the international courts came, and they had a week together. So I think as we look at the United Nations in the future that we're dreaming of, in the context of the world that we're dreaming of, and that right now is leaving us very concerned, I think we need to reach out to some of these other systems that could contribute so much more, and that this thinking in the silo, most of you worked in the UN. I worked in the OAS and in ICA for 23 years, and now have been running my own foundation. Okay, the next area has to do with some things that Dr. Slutkin said, and I call that growing the people, humanity evolving. There's a wonderful man named Gabor Mate who's talking about compassionate inquiry, and he's training all over the world. And we have taken one of his people who he's trained, and we're going to put that work into a project at the grassroots level. So I think we need to connect more with these brilliant people who are helping humanity to evolve, because that's an important issue that I don't think we're taking care of enough. And the last point does have to do with financial architecture. I've worked with grassroots credit systems, and I think financial architecture is not reaching the people who are really poor in the world. And one of the things that I'm committed to doing over the next 10 years of my life is making sure that the IMF and the World Bank and the IDB and all of these other guys who are doing wonderful things, but it's not enough. And so after my 50 years of experience with poverty, I have a right to say to them, it's not enough, come into the fold. But what I would say to folks and to all of you is, let's do it together. let's all bring this wonderful expertise that we've been sharing today and the concept of meeting every Monday. And let's talk more about how we can all do it together. So now I have to give the floor to my dear friend Yoriko. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Always very good interventions, and thanks for reminding us of other levels, and not to forget the people who are really doing on the ground the work. And working together is our ideal. And thank you for joining us for these talks first. Action coming soon, we hope. Yoriko, I hope you're not next to a room in neighbors in Costa Rica. I don't know, or you are have set up and.
Yes, we're not quite next door neighbors, but we're not that far away from one another.
Okay.
No, just trying to think about what one of the colleagues said about how from civil society we can support a more active and constructive role for the UN. And I think one of them would be, even though I haven't been doing that because I haven't been in my own country for so long, is to, I think, get involved in local and national politics. And to try to influence through those paths the way one's own government acts at the UN and what positions it takes. And I would think that, even now, this idea of, writing to or engaging with your own congressperson or your MP, and making them see that this is one way of earning your vote. And the votes of other constituents is to help to strengthen the UN and to take constructive positions at the UN in resolving global conflicts and supporting sustainable development and so on.
Thank you. Yes, some of us have tried even to work through the politics of our countries, but I don't know how many successful former UN people are in politics. De Cuellar became also prime minister of his country. I don't know, but exceptional. Anybody else here involved in politics? Jose Luis, you want?
No, myself, I got closer at some point in my life, and then I realized that I don't have such the necessary hard skin to face it.
But you can influence, right? Yes.
Yes, but something that strikes me, when you look at the diplomatic literature around the world, the amount of books written by diplomats is huge. The amount of books written by multilateral people, UN staff, is not that big for a crowd that is supposed to have such a wealth of experience, such exposure to the real world in so many places, doing so many diverse things, and yet there is not so much production, intellectual production. It's something that I noticed in the past, and I was wondering why. Maybe it's because bilateral diplomats have more spare time and they can write many books than international civil servants. I don't know, but it is there, no? And to me also, to some of the reflections that we made, sometimes I think we live a bit in a bubble. These big gatherings in New York with more and more people involved in. Well, I am part of that crowd. I've been doing civil society, capacity building everywhere. And I know that these people, these are not the world. These are not the world. Anybody who can spend in New York 1 week at the huge prices of New York, that's not a person reflecting the world. Anybody who can spend $200, $300 a day living in New York, which is the minimum you need to be there in a hotel, is not reflecting of the world. So sometimes, and even wonder how many of the successes that the UN agencies claim for themselves are really theirs, or it's just other factors that have intervened, and the UN has been lucky enough to surf over them, including development, UNDP, which was supposed to develop countries. And yeah, I cannot help it, but I have this not that positive view and I'm blaming myself as much as the structures, no? But what we have seen in Africa, the development of some parts of Africa, I don't think it has much to do with the UN. Maybe the awareness of human rights around the world, yes, that wherever you go these days, more or less, that language is present in the structures, but not in the reality of the life of the people. On the contrary, what has happened is that now everybody speaks the language of human rights and doesn't do anything that is in accordance, but they speak it. They learn how to say it. And on this, as I said, the capacity building, at the end of the day, I guess many of you have been involved in capacity building in countries. What do? You teach people to present projects for international funding. That's what you really do. Obviously, the English language is something that can be, because those who do not have access to these international structures, maybe in Latin America is slightly different with the language issue. But I'm seeing this right now. I'm doing a tour, and I always bump into the think tanks, local think tanks, local structures that have been in touch with the international community, and I'm not sure that they really embody their societies. Okay, thank you.
Right, it's good to have self-criticism, of course, and hypocrisy is a human thing all over there in the common narrative of humanity. So, but as I think Henk Jan said it also, the frameworks that we have created, like the SDGs and the human rights, we hope it's something, right? And you don't want to save the world by doing it as UNDP, but you want to have the local capacity activated, right? That's a mistake perhaps we've made in the past, trying to, save the others with just, I don't know, a catalytic role or what. In the remaining 15 minutes, what would you like to see for the UN, for approaching autocrats perhaps, or how to deal with the situation, the possibility of breaking up from the internet to science to outer space stations? For me, these big things would be one world, but they seem to becoming more and more separate. One financial system or not? Incremental or quick change? And how do you influence this? And if we have any capacity here, and how open we are also to others. It's true that mostly we are from a Western perspective, I suppose, speaking here, even if we want to be open. And you saw the comments from Lerato, who is a colleague from South Africa, and she had to leave, unfortunately. I was going to give her the floor. We have to bring more voices like that, and I would welcome that. Kirsten, we don't see you, but we see your hand. Yeah.
Okay, now, first point I would like to make is whatever is going to happen to the UN, to multilateralism, is the result of an interplay of forces. Now, we know that the US under Trump will bring in a lot of destructive power. So one of the responses has to be, as we have had also in this discussion at the beginning, we have to have our facts and figures at our fingertips to show, that multilateralism is the way forward, that it produces better results than to be destructive. Secondly, as whatever is going to happen is the result of an interplay of forces, there are only going to be incremental changes. There is not going to be a big bang. But, I recall when I was in China in the early 80s and then in the late 90s, when in the US climate change still was not on the cards. A lot of the young scientists and NGO guys came to China to help China embrace renewable energy and energy saving and all the rest of it. And so even if the US drops out of fighting climate change, let's focus on China and India because these are two big emitters too. And if we can help them to be even more efficient than they are now, then they will make a major contribution. So in a way, without too much verbal and acrimony, we should just try to circumvent the US. We should just, if you so want, isolate them until they come back to their senses. I'm not feeling too well, so I will stop here. But I think we have to realize that we will really have to have our wits about ourselves to read the interplay between the various geopolitical forces well, and to make sure that it all leads in the direction of those synergies that actually produce the best results with regard to people having jobs, people being safe, there is no war, there is climate change being fought, there is respect for human rights. And I think it's going to be a daily struggle, and with a multitude of small steps at various levels, at the national, international level. And we should just not get too much distracted by those who think this is all for the birds and needs to be dismantled. Thank you.
Thank you. Perseverance, yes, should be our middle name. And thanks a lot, Kerstin. And you were, of course, RC resident coordinator in China for the UN, and you have a lot of experience in practice in the field. So anybody else with the solutions or proposals for the way forward? Some of you, like Jose Luis and Carlos, teach also younger people. How do you see their responses? You are at universities, right? After having all this practical experience.
I used to ask my students at some point in the course, we had this debate on the universality of democracy and so on. Who prefers to live in a democratic country that is poor than in an autocratic country that is rich? And 10 years ago, everybody was democratic country. Now, in the last this year, everyone except 1 or 2 out of 40 students prefer to live in an autocratic environment that is wealthy. Than in a
breakdown of your students is the same. I mean, do they come from Western Europe or
all over the? No, there's a lot of from the Arab world. There's a lot of Europeans, Americans, North and South, Arab world, and Eastern Europeans, a few, and a couple of Chinese, 2 or 3 Chinese every year. So it's quite assorted. And there are a little bit of world bourgeoisie, I have to say. But this question, last time I did the live survey, I didn't know how to react. I told them, listen, this has been changing over years. And well, I suppose they have the reasons. That's all I can say. I think that everybody has in mind some countries of the Gulf that have become places where people want to live and are certainly autocratic.
Right.
And why do we think that these people value a better material life?
Absolutely. Maybe
as opposed to their freedoms? Why do you think this is emerging? Why do all of us think this is emerging?
I think it also goes with the paradigm that we used to believe in, that democracy and material wealth were going hand in hand, because for until almost 15 years ago, the richest countries of the world were also democracies. It's just a recent phenomenon that we have rich countries which are not democracies. So I think people are beginning to see that you can live very well. Of course, if you are in the group of those who are relatively well off in those countries, then in other places, maybe also for some, is that they don't know really what it is to live in an environment with lack of freedoms and basic political rights, right?
Right, Gary. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the last thing you said, Jose, was really what I was thinking is that they probably don't know, because that's what I think was happening. Part of what was happening in America during this last election is that the people don't really know what it's like to live in a situation of not having rights and living in relative fear and restriction and oppression and people disappearing and things like this. I don't want to accept, I don't want to, I don't know that it's correct to accept that people are preferring to be without rights. But I just wanted to add that it brings me back to the value of communication and public education in support of the essential principles and of human rights, and also of how much progress there is or isn't in some of in a way you might say, the key indicators of the world. And by country, this can get complex or it can be simplified, but it's been, generally speaking, I come from, as Kirsten does as well, a World Health Organization background, and countries would get encouraged by seeing, or discouraged, or would be motivated by seeing each other's relative immunization rates, or child mortality rates, or, whatever rights could be quantified, and so on. So we're living in a world where most of the general population doesn't have an understanding of whether, I mean, everybody has their own daily life, but we're not seeing any larger picture, and we're not being communicated with as to what's possible, or to direction to be moving in. So all kinds of things related to solidarity or related to a better world or the climate, where it only shows up once in a while rather than being, continuous communication. And just also, I can't remember who it was that brought forward. Oh yeah, it was our other Jan, I guess, that what Gebr Mate is doing. There's a number of individuals and groups who are developing kind of global initiatives related to I don't know what you want to call it, mental health, emotional health, psychological development, how to interact with each other and things like that. And we're missing a lot of this. Is all in the realm of public education and communication. And this is related to, anything that spreads, to understanding it better, whether it's COVID or whether it's HIV/AIDS, or whether it's, good government or human rights or immunization. All of these things have, ways to be promoted and ways to be brought out of the invisible into the visible by communication in public education.
Lots of work to do.
The UN Charter itself, the 2 or 3 key principles, and whether we're as an Earth, as a world, are following them or not.
One thing is to go out, right, and speak more, and not only to ourselves, but also, to spread the word in a good way. Thanks, Gary. And Yoriko, probably the last speaker.
Oh, thank you. On this issue of whether you prefer a prosperous autocracy or a poorly run democracy, I have my doubts about these, surveys, which Latin America does regularly. There's a survey called Latino Barometro, and you do see supposedly support for democracy going down continuously. But I just think it's the wrong question, to present this dichotomy as if, it's either or. Whereas, the question should be how can we make democracies work better for people? And in fact, in this region, this was UNDP actually, with experts from many countries in the Latin America region, put out a really good report on the state of democracy in this region. The first edition was in 2004 or 5 or so, and it presents. It proposes thinking of two kinds of citizenship. One is political citizenship, another is social citizenship. And the way that it looks at democracy, the state of democracy in the region is that, and in the world really, is that political citizenship has seen great advances. In this region particularly, most countries have free and fair elections. Everybody gets to vote. But that hasn't translated into improvements in material improvements in life. And so the challenge is to fulfill both political and social citizenship. And I think this is something that the UN could very well address without maybe speaking of democracy, which is kind of a loaded word geopolitically, but in terms of promoting a debate on how to fulfill rights in all spheres of life, political and civil rights, social rights, economic.
Right. And a sense of wellness and whatever stability and solidarity and all that seem to be missing. I don't think I can summarize what has been said. Thank you all for contributing your thoughts. We can go back and watch the video if you want on Facebook. We'll also put it on YouTube eventually to extract whatever we can. And then we saw in the previous discussion we had on the on the Middle East, there was at least one thing that came out of it, a letter to the Secretary General. It was confidential when it was sent. I can say it now more or less. The content with recommendations of really coming in and appointing an envoy, starting a process of reconciliation, talking to both parties, bringing their positive people and elements together, and also bringing Palestine as an equal member state into the UN. So there were things, but that came out. And out of this, I hope those who want to continue get in touch. We don't want to just talk, but also do things. The next planned discussion will be on Monday, the 9th of December, and Yoriko will be facilitating that one on building a culture of peace at a time of global turmoil. So partly the discussion can continue there. And as was said, the very important peace and security sector has not perhaps been dealt with adequately up to now. An opportunity to continue the discussion on that there. So thank you all very much. And keep doing what you're doing, and let's try to work together.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Georgios.
Ciao, bye-bye.
Thank you, Georgios.
Bye, guys.
Thank you, Jakob.
Thanks so much, everyone.